So my initial presentation was going to be building a Flask extension in under 5 minutes. Since we had more time, I kind of changed the presentation a little bit. And what I'm going to be trying to do is either convince or confuse you into believing that Flask extensions is a really good way to provide modularity in your Flask code bases. So a little bit about me. I currently work at a company called Zephyr, based out of Venice Beach, California. We build cool products evolving around the YouTube ecosystem. We are hiring, like probably many of the other companies that are here today. Also, you may know me from some stuff I've done in the past. I'm the author of Flask Classy, which is a Flask extension that makes it easy to build RESTful web applications. So you might come to see me later on, by the way, and want to say hi, and you don't feel like calling me Freedom. You want to use a nickname. Free is fine. Dumb is not. Unless you totally hate my presentation, and then I understand. So how many of you guys have built Flask applications like from the ground up, like just started from a application.py? Awesome. Or maybe even a bottle application or some other micro framework. So a lot of us have gone through the same exact experience, right? So you start off with this one file, and you're building your views and your models and stuff. Maybe even got Flask SQL Alchemy in there so you can hook up to a database. And as you go and your code base grows, you start breaking it apart. You've got your views, your models, your forms, and the application is growing bigger. Maybe you want to have an admin interface, so you start introducing blueprints. Do you guys all know what blueprints are in Flask? Anybody who doesn't know what that is? It's like a sub-application inside of your application. And as the application continues to grow, you're adding more blueprints. Everything's nice. And somewhere along the way, this guy shows up, right? You guys have all seen this. I know you have in some application or another. And that's fine. He's our junk drawer. We're going to throw stuff in there that we're not really sure where it goes yet. And then maybe this guy shows up too. He's got some base classes, and we're using that here and there, maybe in the blueprints, maybe in the application. And then helpers shows up because we got to find, it's not really a utility, it's a helper. And now this stuff is getting bigger, so you're putting it in folders and packages, and it's growing. I can see faces out there who are like, yep, I've got one of these at home. And it's crazy because you start feeling like the code is spreading and it's getting bigger, and you're like, where is the application logic, and where's my helping like what am I doing? And before you know it, you can't sleep at night anymore. We've been there, right? The question really though is why? Why does this happen to us so often, especially when we're building Flask applications from the start? And it's not a complicated question. The reality is that Flask is a micro framework. It's small, it's tiny. It doesn't give you everything you need. It gives you something to build on. And when you've got that, and you've got that flexibility, nobody's telling you where to put your code or how to structure your application, you're going to start guessing at some point. And sometimes just to get things done, you're going to make a compromise here or there. And that's okay. But you got to think about it this way. Code that doesn't care about your application, but that your application depends on, that's probably something separate. That's probably not your application, right? What are those things? Think about it. You want ORM? That's an extension. You've got some authentication layer that's not unique in any way. That's an extension. You've got these cool debugging utilities that you're going to add in and remove when you go into production, like the cool Flask debug toolbar. That's an extension. How about base class libraries and utilities? You know what would make a really great extension? If I could get this extension that would let me easily rate limit my Flask views. That would be awesome. I would love that extension. Definitely an extension. Staring out the window? The whole reason for this entire presentation is so I could do this joke, actually. But no, seriously, think about it. This is code that's not special to your application. You've got to package it up somehow and stop blending it in and mixing it in. Any application agnostic logic, that is probably a good candidate for an extension. And I'm not saying an extension that you're going to publish and become famous for. This might be just an internal extension that you use with applications within your organization. It might be an extension that's only ever used on one application, but an extension is a great place to put that logic. So for those of you who have never looked inside of an extension, Let's take a look at what they look like. At the very bare minimum, a Flask extension is just a Flask module, like Flask underscore something .py, right? This is a something extension. Bare minimum. If you wanted to put this on the cheese shop, you're going to add a setup.py, a license, and readme like anything else. And if you want it to be included on the Flask extensions registry, you just need to make sure that you include docs, tests, and a license that is either BSD, MIT, or something more liberal or compatible with the Flask license. But that's really all you need to have to create a Flask extension. So that takes us to the first rule. The name is important. When I said Flask underscore something, I'm putting Flask there because I just wanted to make it clear to you that I was talking about a Flask extension. It's actually something that Flask uses. So Flask has a cool extension loader that helps make sure all the namespaces are part of the ext namespace. So Flask underscore something becomes flask.ext something when your users are using your extension. So rule number 1, Flask underscore whatever your module name is. So what goes inside of Flask something.py? There's really 2 main instances of our extension for each one, and get these weird extensions. No, don't do that, please. In fact, the documentation says you shouldn't do that. The right way is simply to make it so that they don't have to pass the application instance into your constructor, and use that init app method that we were talking about to initialize each application instance. And if you really wanted to be friendly, you might even do an init apps method that could take any number of applications. And that takes me to rule number 2. You must, if you want to get into the Flask extension registry, you've got to support multiple app instances. When you're testing, you're probably creating more than one app instance. When you're building multifaceted applications that have API endpoints and web console endpoints, you're probably building multiple applications. Don't make it hard on yourself. Make sure you support multiple app instances. All right, so before we start looking at the inside of an extension and start looking at what our extension is going to be capable of, let's look at the kinds of things that a Flask extension actually can do. So, for example, we can do some really simple things. Like we can read and write to the session. We can add variables to the template context. And we can add template filters and global functions to the template context. So, and we'll probably look at some of these simple things in our example extension at the end of this. But you can also do some more interesting things. You can register logging and exception handlers in your extension. You can register a view in your extension. Make sure when you're doing that you're not clobbering endpoints that your users might be using, so use some sort of smart namespacing. And you can also define decorators that you could use to wrap up views and make them very reusable. And then you get these really cool things that you can do. Like you can register an entire blueprint. So blueprint, as I said before, it's a mini application or a sub-application. So for example, let's say you have an extension that has some sort of dashboard interface. By just installing this extension into your application, now you've got a dashboard. There's a really cool project called RQ, which is a Redis queue. Redis queue has this project called RQ dashboard, which makes it easy to see what's happening on your queue. And that RQ dashboard includes a Flask extension that just puts the dashboard right in your application. So for all, you've got a queue management dashboard. You can manage request scope resources like database connections. This is what most Flask extensions that people are familiar with do. Like, it'll set up a database connection at the beginning of the request and tear it down at the end of the request. And you can also profile and analyze the performance of your system. Imagine if your system is having trouble. There's certain requests that are kind of slow. And you could just hit a switch somewhere, change a configuration variable, and now all of a sudden on those particular requests, we're logging the time it takes, we're taking a look, maybe even injecting stuff into the code to see if we can profile it a little bit deeper. And then you can also do really dangerous things. Like you can monkey patch and modify the application instance. It's Python, right? You could actually just gouge the eyes out of Flask if you wanted to while it's running. You can hijack and override the requests and responses so that you're not fully in control of some functionality to Flask. So what our extension does is it adds a couple of template globals that will let me, as a user, easily inject some text or some image into my templates. So some text returns some blob of lorem, and some image just returns some image that I found on the internet. You could imagine this being a little bit more sophisticated than this, but if it was, then it wouldn't fit on the screen. So I did not do that. But let's take a look at how this might actually be useful. So just by having this extension installed in my Flask application, I'd be able to do something like this. I'm making some Flask app. I've got some place where I need to put a description, but I don't have that content yet. Marketing is slow to get me the content I need, and I need to make this look good now. I can use this extension to just inject some text right here for now, and I need some image placeholder until I get the images. I can use some image to just inject an image URL right where I need it. And you can imagine extending this. What if I just needed some data, or if I just needed some form or something like that? Just being able to inject placeholder content is what Flask something, I guess, is all about. So that's how you can make something kind of useful without a lot of effort, really. So that's really the end of my talk. I've got time for questions because I went faster than I thought I would. And does anybody have any? I guess is the follow-up question.
Once you have an extension, how do you actually get it registered on the Flask extension registry?
So the way to do this, and this is actually a good question. The question is, once you've created an extension, how do you get it into the Flask extension registry? And the answer is to become friends with Armin or Kenneth. But if you can't do that, then what you need to do is create a pull request to the Flask repository. One of the branches is the Flask website. So literally just go in there, make a fork, add your extension into the list, make a pull request, and then send some emails and messages out saying, please look at this and accept it. But that's really the process. It's not formalized or anything like that. So, any other questions?
This one?
So, you said don't break Flask. Can you give an example of how you would actually?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can replace Flask's a Flask application's built-in functions, right? So let's just say, for example, you don't like Flask's routing mechanism, and you replace app.route with your own decorator. You totally can do that, right? But if your user is not aware of your modifications, you are going to break their expectation. And that's obviously a very blatant one, but there are more subtle ones that I've seen happen where somebody just tries to change things about application context management and things like that. And when you don't know that stuff is happening behind the scenes like that, it can be very frustrating. You're wondering, where did this code change come from, or why isn't Flask behaving the way it is in all of these demo applications? So make sure you maintain the contracts that Flask as a framework is already making with its users.
And it's the case that you always have to explicitly import the particular extension with an import command. You don't like place it in some location and you get them all.
Yeah, so the question is, with Flask extensions, do you always import instead of just putting them in some folder somewhere and let Flask pick it up? And the answer is yes, you always import Flask extensions. Flask is not going to go looking for them for you.
One more?
So you have a huge library of code, and then you decide to implement Flask. Like I can think of a half a dozen different ways how I might make Flask extensions, but like what would you recommend how to expose those as Flask extensions in your code that's shared with other code?
So what I would probably do, given that base, not knowing the code base, but I would look for common pieces of functionality in that code base. Like, is there a set of decorators that's all about one theme? And I'd probably start there and just let's make a new project, port those over to a Flask extension, and then figure out a way that I can access that new Flask extension either by installing it into that other application's virtual env, or maybe just being able to put it near enough that I can import it directly, some way like that. But basically just piecemeal it, but do it by theme. That's really important. A Flask extension that's just got a bunch of stuff in it, you've basically taken your junk drawer and moved it to the garage. And that is, yeah. So,
All right.
great. Thank you very much, guys.